You weren't invited to dinner. My husband doesn't want you there. That was the text my daughter sent me. 10 simple words. 10 words that cut deeper than anything I had ever heard in my life. After everything I had done for her, after the years of working double shifts, saving every spare dollar, and pouring my heart into making sure she never went without, this was how she dismissed me. With a single text message. And it wasn't just any moment in her life. It was just weeks after I had made the final payment on the down payment for her new home. A house she and her husband now walked through proudly, taking pictures, hosting friends, living the dream they claimed was built on their own hard work. But the truth was, it was my sacrifice that had opened those doors. I stared at the screen for a long time, reading the message over and over, waiting for it to change, waiting for her to call me and say it was a mistake. But the silence never broke. Most mothers might have cried. Some might have begged for an explanation, pleading to be included, desperate to hold on to their children no matter how badly they were treated. But I didn't cry. And I didn't beg. I simply typed one word back. Sure. No question. Just, sure. Because what my daughter and her husband didn't know was that while they thought they had the upper hand, I had something they didn't expect. I had kept every single receipt. 195 payments. Proof of every dime I had poured into their so-called dream life. I had given them comfort. I had given them stability. And with one quiet decision, I could take it all back. And so I did. I canceled every single payment. Methodically, patiently, quietly. And as I pressed that final confirmation, I didn't feel regret. I felt something else, an almost chilling calm. That was the moment the balance shifted. They didn't know it yet, but the foundation of their perfect life had already started to crumble, and all I had to do was wait. Because this isn't just a story about a daughter turning her back on her mother. This is a story about betrayal, about silence, and about what happens when you push someone who has given you everything too far. Mothers like me give and give, often without being asked. If you've ever known a mother, or been one who put her life on hold for her child, don't just listen to this story. Show her some love. Hit that like button right now, because every sacrifice deserves to be remembered. I was never supposed to raise her alone. When my husband passed away, my daughter was just 9 years old. Too young to fully understand death, but old enough to feel the absence. I remember the night of the funeral, her small hand clinging to mine, her wide eyes searching the crowd, as if her father might still walk in and tell us it was all a mistake. That night I made her a promise. I told her she would never have to feel abandoned, never have to wonder where love or support would come from. And from that moment on, every choice I made revolved around her. I was a middle-class woman, with no inheritance, no safety net waiting to catch me. Just long hours and the determination that my daughter's future would not be defined by tragedy. I took on 2 jobs, days spent working at the local bank as a clerk, evenings and weekends waiting tables at a diner where the regulars knew me by name. There were nights when my body ached so badly I could barely climb into bed. But every dollar I earned, every hour I spent on my feet, was fuel for her life. When she was 12, she wanted to join the school's dance team. The costumes, the travel fees, the shoes. It was more than I had at the time. I remember standing in the grocery aisle, staring at the difference between buying what we needed and what would allow her to shine on that stage. I chose her. I always chose her. And I will never forget the joy on her face when she came home with her first medal. She looked at me as if I had made magic happen, when really all I had done was skip a few meals and wear the same coat through another winter. High school brought its own challenges. Her first heartbreak, sitting on the edge of her bed while she sobbed over a boy who had decided she wasn't enough. I listened. I held her. I told her she was more than enough, that one day someone would see her worth. College came next, and with it tuition payments I had no business covering. But somehow I made it happen. Community college first, then the transfer to a university where she thrived. I worked extra shifts, I sold my wedding ring, and I told no one how hard it was. She graduated with honors. That moment, seeing her in her cap and gown, was the payoff I had been waiting for. She didn't just walk across that stage for herself, she walked for me too. When she introduced me to Ethan, I wanted so badly to believe he was the one I had promised her she would find. He was polite, neatly dressed, the kind of man who knew how to shake a hand and say the right things in front of people. He called me ma'am at first, opening doors, smiling often, presenting himself as dependable. But underneath all of that, there was something that kept me uneasy. I could never put my finger on it. Maybe it was the way his smile never quite reached his eyes, or how he shifted uncomfortably when I asked him simple questions about his family or his job. There was one moment that sealed my unease, though I brushed it aside at the time. We were sitting in my living room, the three of us, sharing takeout after a long day. I asked him how he and my daughter had met, a simple enough question. He answered with a story, smiling but not once. Throughout that entire explanation, did he look me in the eye? He looked at her, he looked at the floor, he looked at the TV, but never at me. I felt it in my gut. That should have been my first warning. But love is a powerful blindfold. And I wanted her to be happy. She laughed with him, leaned into him, spoke about their plans as if the future had finally arrived. I told myself to trust her judgment, even when my instincts whispered otherwise. After all, I had raised her to be strong, to make her own choices. The engagement came quickly. Too quickly, some said. But when she walked into my kitchen, glowing with a ring on her finger, I bit back every question. Instead, I hugged her. I congratulated her. I told her that if she had found the man she wanted to build a life with, I would stand by her, even if my doubts remained. The wedding was simple, a modest ceremony in a rented hall. I paid for more than I should have, but I did it gladly. Watching her walk down the aisle, I reminded myself that this was her story now. I had done my part. I had raised her, supported her, carried her when she couldn't carry herself. Now it was her turn to build something of her own. But soon after the wedding, the conversations began. Little comments about how they wished they could afford a bigger place, a house instead of their cramped apartment. Ethan, in particular, seemed to circle back to the subject often. He spoke of neighborhoods they couldn't quite reach, of friends who had bought homes, of how renting was throwing money away. My daughter echoed his words, almost rehearsed. First I nodded, sympathized, said I understood. But then she looked at me one evening, her voice soft, her eyes hopeful, and asked if I could help. And that was all it took. The promise I made at her father's funeral came rushing back. That vow I had carried all these years, that she would never feel abandoned, never feel unsupported. I couldn't give her father back, but I could give her this. So I told her yes. I told her I would help them get the house of their dreams. I drained my savings. I cut every corner I could. I kept every receipt, partly for my records, partly because old habits of careful budgeting never die. 195 payments in total, each one a piece of my own life carved away so she could have hers. And when the final check was signed, when the realtor placed those shiny keys in her hand, I stood on that front porch and told myself it was worth it. I looked at her beaming face, her arms wrapped around Ethan, and I told myself that maybe this was the happy ending we both deserved. That maybe my instincts had been wrong. That maybe the unease I felt was nothing more than an overprotective mother's caution. But deep inside, in a place I didn't want to admit existed, a whisper lingered. A whisper that told me nothing in this world comes without a cost. And though I couldn't see it yet, the price I was about to pay for that house was far greater than money. When I agreed to help them with the house, I told myself it was just another chapter in the long book of sacrifices I had made for my daughter. I didn't think of it as losing money. I thought of it as giving her security, a place where she could start a family, a foundation that could not be shaken. I walked into that bank with my head held high, handed over my savings, and signed my name on lines that seemed to stretch on forever. Every check I wrote felt heavy, not because I didn't want to part with the money, but because I knew exactly what those dollars represented. Years of sweat, aching feet from long shifts, birthdays I had worked through, holidays I had missed. But I told myself it was worth it, because her happiness was always worth more than anything I could hold in my hands. I kept every receipt, every wire transfer confirmation, every canceled check, every stamped paper that tied my sacrifice to their dream. I tucked them into a folder, neat and organized, a habit from years of careful budgeting. I didn't think I would ever need them for anything more than my own peace of mind. But I held on to them anyway. 195 payments in total, each one telling a story of its own. The day came when the realtor finally handed over the keys. I remember standing in the driveway, watching my daughter unlock the door for the very first time. She squealed like she had when she was a child opening Christmas presents, bouncing on her toes as she pushed the door open and rushed inside. She twirled in the empty living room, her arms outstretched, her laughter filling the air like music. In that moment, I felt a swell of pride so strong it nearly broke me. This was why I had worked myself to the bone. This was why I had kept pushing forward even when I was exhausted and alone. She grabbed my hands and pulled me inside, pointing out where they would put the couch, where they planned to hang their wedding pictures, how the kitchen would be perfect for family dinners. She spoke quickly, her words tumbling over each other, her excitement impossible to contain. For a moment, I allowed myself to believe that maybe I had finally reached the finish line. That maybe, just maybe, all the sacrifices had led us here, to a place of peace, of family, of new beginnings. But even in that joy, something gnawed at me. Ethan stood in the corner, his arms folded, his eyes scanning the room not with wonder, but with calculation. He wasn't laughing with her. He wasn't swept away by the magic of that first moment in a new home. Instead, he seemed almost satisfied, like a man checking an item off a list. When he finally spoke, his words weren't about family or love or memories to be made. He said almost under his breath, "This is just the beginning." At the time, I brushed it off. I told myself he was simply excited, that his seriousness was just his way of handling big moments. But deep down, I felt a pang of unease. My daughter's joy had been pure, unfiltered, radiant. His, however, felt tied to the bricks and mortar, to ownership, to possession. He walked through the house with measured steps, pointing out upgrades, asking about the square footage, already talking about how much the property might be worth in a few years. He wasn't seeing a home. He was seeing an investment. Still, I silenced that inner voice. I reminded myself that people show excitement in different ways. I told myself that as long as my daughter was happy, that was enough. I wanted so badly to believe that love could soften any man's edges, that my daughter's warmth and laughter would melt whatever coldness lived inside him. She had always had that effect on me. Her smile could lift me out of any darkness. I thought she could do the same for him. That night, after the housewarming, I sat alone in my small kitchen with a folder of receipts spread out in front of me. I traced the lines of ink with my fingers, whispering a quiet prayer that this house would be the foundation for something lasting, something beautiful. I told myself that this was my legacy, not money in a bank account, but a home built from love and sacrifice. I pictured holidays in that dining room, grandchildren playing in the yard, Sunday dinners where my chair at the table would always be waiting. What I didn't see, what I refused to see, was the way Ethan's hand lingered just a little too long on the deed, the way his smile was directed more at the paperwork than at his wife, the way his eyes glimmered not with love, but with ownership. In that moment, I chose trust. I chose to believe in my daughter's choice, in her laughter, in the life she said she was building, and I told myself, perhaps foolishly, that whatever shadows I sensed in him would fade under the light of her love. But I was wrong. Very wrong. And the truth of that would come to hit me harder than I could have ever imagined. At first, life in the new house seemed to move along the way young marriages do. Boxes unpacked, curtains hung, new routines taking shape. My daughter called me often in those first few weeks, bubbling with excitement about the little things. The first meal they cooked together in the kitchen, the sound of rain against the new roof, the thrill of decorating their bedroom exactly the way she had always dreamed. I clung to those phone calls as proof that everything was unfolding the way it should. But then slowly changes began to creep in, small at first, almost too subtle to notice. It began with the gatherings. Before the house, I was included in everything: Sunday dinners, birthday celebrations, even quiet Friday nights where we shared takeout and watched movies on the couch. But now, when I would ask about the weekend, my daughter would hesitate. Her voice carried a tone I hadn't heard before, careful, measured. "Oh, Mom, Ethan's co-workers are coming over. It might be too crowded." Or, "We just need a little time to ourselves this weekend." At first, I understood. Newlyweds need their space, I told myself. But the excuses kept piling up. There was always some reason why I shouldn't come by. One evening, I baked her favorite pie and drove across town, unannounced, the way I used to. I stood at the door with that pie in my hands, only to hear voices inside, laughter, clinking glasses, music playing softly. When she finally opened the door, her smile was strained, her body blocking the view into the living room. Behind her shoulder, I caught a glimpse of a table full of food, friends gathered, and Ethan leaning against the wall, his arm around one of his buddies as if it were his housewarming all over again. She stepped outside, shutting the door behind her, and said quickly, "Mom, I wish you'd called first. It's just not a good time." I held out the pie anyway, forcing a smile, but as she took it, I saw the flicker of embarrassment in her eyes. Not because I had shown up, but because I was there at all. The weekly visits that had once been sacred to us began to vanish. Thursdays had always been ours. No matter how busy life got, she and I would meet for dinner, sometimes at a restaurant, sometimes in my kitchen, sometimes on her couch with Chinese takeout. It was our tradition, a promise we had kept since she was in college. But now every week brought a new excuse. Work ran late. Ethan's tired. We're meeting friends. I tried not to push, but the emptiness on those nights gnawed at me. I found myself setting the table out of habit, only to clear it again untouched, telling myself it was just a phase. And then there was her tone. My daughter, who had once confided everything in me, who used to curl up on the couch and tell me her worries, now grew tense at the mere mention of her husband's name. If I asked how Ethan was doing, her answers came quick, clipped, rehearsed. "He's fine. Work's fine." Everything's fine. And if I dared to press even a little, her voice sharpened, her eyes darted away. Mom, why do you always ask so many questions? Can't you just be happy for me? It wasn't just what she said, it was how she said it. Defensive. Guarded. As if my concern was an intrusion rather than the natural rhythm of our bond. I could feel the distance widening, an invisible wall built brick by brick between us. And I knew she wasn't the one building it. Ethan's presence loomed over every conversation, even when he wasn't in the room. His shadow stretched into our relationship, bending it, reshaping it into something unrecognizable. I began to see the pattern, the gatherings where I wasn't welcome, the traditions that quietly dissolved, the new sharpness in her tone. I recognized the subtle signs of manipulation. Though I prayed I was wrong. I had seen it before in other marriages, friends whose partners isolated them, made them choose between family and spouse. I never imagined I would watch it happen to my own daughter. But I stayed silent. I told myself it wasn't my place to interfere. I reminded myself that she was grown, that she had chosen her husband, that maybe I was just being protective, maybe even jealous of the space she now gave to him instead of me. I convinced myself that silence was love, that if I said nothing, she would eventually come back to me, the way she always had. Still, silence has a way of breaking you from the inside out. Each unanswered phone call, each canceled dinner, each strained smile chipped away at me. And then one evening, the silence broke in the cruelest way possible. It was a Friday. I had sent her a message earlier in the day, asking if I could come by with groceries, maybe cook dinner for the three of us. Hours passed without a reply. I busied myself in the kitchen, waiting for the sound of my phone. And then just as I was settling down for the night, the message came. You weren't invited to dinner. My husband doesn't want you there. I read it once, then again, my eyes stinging as the words sank in. My daughter, my only child, had written those words with her own hands. It wasn't a suggestion. It wasn't softened with apologies. It was final, firm, cold. I sat there, staring at the glow of the screen, waiting for something more. Waiting for a follow-up message, a phone call, anything that would soften the blow. But nothing came. Just silence. The same silence that had been growing between us, now solidified into a sentence that cut through me like a knife. And in that moment, I realized the distance was no longer creeping. It had arrived. And I was standing on the outside, locked away from the life I had built with my own hands. I must have read that message 100 times that night, my eyes darting over the same cruel words, until they burned into me like a brand. You weren't invited to dinner. My husband doesn't want you there. I whispered them aloud just to hear how they sounded outside the glow of a screen, as if saying them might make them less real. But they didn't lose their edge. They cut deeper with every repetition, as though my daughter had driven a wedge straight through the bond one thought could never break. The silence of my house seemed louder than ever, the ticking of the clock on the wall taunting me with every passing second. I sat at the table with my hands clasped, torn between heartbreak and fury, between collapsing under the weight of her rejection, and rising with the quiet strength I had built over years of hardship. My chest ached, my throat tightened, and for a moment I thought the tears would come. But they didn't. Not one. Instead, I felt an anger settle in me, cold and deliberate. It wasn't the kind of anger that screams or throws things across the room. It was heavier than that. It was the anger of a woman who has given everything, only to be told she is nothing. The anger of a mother who sacrificed her own life to build someone else's, and was then discarded as though she were an inconvenience. The question circled my mind relentlessly. Do I cry, or do I fight back? And the answer came slowly, in the quietest of whispers inside me. Neither. I will not beg, and I will not crumble. I will not fight with words that will be twisted against me. I will fight with silence, and with the one thing they never imagined I would use. My fingers hovered over the keyboard for what felt like an eternity. 1,000 responses crossed my mind. I wanted to remind her of the nights I stayed awake sewing costumes for her school plays, of the mornings I walked to work in the rain just so she could take the bus, of the times I went without food so she wouldn't. I wanted to ask her if Ethan had been worth the price of her mother's heart. I wanted to scream through the text that I deserve better. But I typed none of that. I simply wrote one word. Sure. It was the most controlled act of my life. A single syllable, standing in place of all the storms that raged inside me. I sent it, put my phone face down on the table, and let the quiet stretch on. That word wasn't surrender. It was the beginning of my decision. Because in that moment, as the house sat in darkness around me, I made myself a vow. If my daughter and her husband wanted me gone, then they would get exactly what they asked for. I would not give them another cent, not another ounce of effort, not a single sacrifice more. And I would not give them the satisfaction of knowing my pain. I thought of the folder tucked neatly in the drawer of my desk, thick with proof of every dollar I had poured into their so-called dream. 195 payments, each one a testament to the life I had given away piece by piece. They thought I had nothing left but love and loyalty to offer, that I was powerless outside the role of mother and provider. They were wrong. I whispered to myself. They wanted me gone. They wanted my silence. Let them see what my silence really means. The next morning, I sat at that same table, the early light spilling across the folder of receipts I had pulled out and spread before me. They looked almost ceremonial, like relics of a past I had built and could now dismantle with the stroke of a pen. My hands didn't shake as I traced the dates, the amounts, the signatures. With every slip of paper I touched, the ache in my chest hardened into resolve. I realized then that this wasn't just about being excluded from a dinner table. This was about being erased from her life. A slow replacement of everything we once shared with a man who saw me as nothing more than a nuisance standing in the way of his control. They had drawn a line, and I would not step across it. Instead, I would stand firmly on my side and watch them struggle without the support they had taken for granted. The night before, I had been a mother on the edge of heartbreak, questioning her worth, drowning in betrayal. But by morning, I was something else entirely. I was a woman who had remembered her strength. I was the keeper of the receipts, the one holding the strings of their fragile dream. And if they thought they could cut me out and keep everything I had given, they were about to learn a truth I had never spoken. I might be quiet, but I am not powerless. As I stacked the receipts back into the folder, sealing them shut, I felt a calm settle over me. A dangerous kind of calm. Not the peace of acceptance, but the steady breath of someone who has chosen their path and knows exactly where it leads. I didn't know what would happen next, but I knew one thing with absolute certainty. My silence would speak louder than any word I could ever send. And so with one word sure, I began the quiet unraveling of everything they thought was secure. Imagine giving everything you have, and the reply you get is, "You're not wanted." If that hits your heart the way it hit mine, subscribe. Don't let stories like this disappear into silence. The morning after that single word reply, I woke with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. There was no hesitation, no wavering back and forth, no asking myself whether I had been too harsh or too soft. The decision was already written in me the moment I read her text. They had told me, in no uncertain terms, that I was unwanted. And so I would give them exactly what they asked for, my absence. But not just my physical absence. My financial presence would vanish too. The very lifeline that carried their new world on its shoulders would be cut, strand by strand, until it collapsed under its own weight. I went to the desk in my bedroom where I had always kept things in order. It wasn't just a drawer of papers to me. It was the story of my labor, my sacrifices, my love translated into numbers and dates. I pulled out the thick folder, heavy with the receipts I had saved with a precision almost obsessive. 195 slips of proof. Every payment I had made to cover a mortgage, to patch up utility bills, to ensure property taxes never fell behind. Every single one was a piece of me. Hours spent working double shifts, long nights when I chose to skip meals, days when I swallowed my pride and went without so that my daughter and her husband could stand inside a house they called their dream. I laid them out across the table one by one in neat rows. The room was quiet except for the sound of paper sliding against paper. It felt ritualistic, almost sacred, like I was preparing an altar to my own endurance. I stared at them, not with sadness, but with a kind of reverence. These weren't just receipts. They were my proof that I had been there, that I had carried them this far. And now, these papers would become my shield. The first step was simple. I opened my laptop, logged into the bank account tied to their payments, and canceled the automatic transfers. My fingers didn't tremble. I clicked stop. And with that single act, years of quiet enabling ended. The screen flashed confirmation. Payment canceled. I leaned back in my chair and let the satisfaction sink in. It was a small victory, but it was the first. Next came the utilities, the steady flow of money I had been feeding to keep their lights on, their water running, their comforts untouched. I pulled out each bill, matched them with the receipts on the table, and called every number listed. My voice was calm, professional, detached. I'd like to remove my payment method from this account. The representatives on the other end didn't know the story behind my request, but I felt a surge of power with every cancellation code they gave me. The accounts were theirs now, fully and completely. Let them handle it. Then I turned to the taxes. That had always been my safety net for them, the expense I feared they'd forget or mishandle. I had paid them without fail like clockwork. But as I flipped through the stubs, I felt a cold resolve strengthen. No more, I whispered under my breath. If they could afford to treat me like an outsider, then they could afford to carry the responsibilities of their own roof. It took me hours. Hours of calling, clicking, cross-checking. Each time I crossed another payment off the list, I felt lighter. For the first time in years, I wasn't pouring myself out for people who saw me as disposable. For the first time, I wasn't their safety net, their doormat, their invisible backbone. I was reclaiming myself, piece by piece, receipt by receipt. When I was finished, I stacked the receipts back into the folder, but this time it wasn't a burden. It was a weapon. 195 slips of undeniable truth. Proof that I had been the one holding everything together. Even as they pushed me further away, they thought they had power over me. They thought their rejection would leave me broken. But I was the one who had been funding their life all along, and I had just pulled the ground out from beneath their feet. The silence afterward was unlike any other. I didn't call my daughter to explain. I didn't send a message to defend myself. I simply waited. I knew the storm would come. I knew their comfortable world would start to shake the moment a bill arrived unpaid, the moment the mortgage office called, the moment the reality of responsibility set in. And when they looked for someone to blame, they would realize the one person they had dismissed was the same person they had depended on all along. I sat in my kitchen, sipping coffee, staring at that closed folder, and I felt something I hadn't in years: freedom. The weight of their entitlement had been lifted, and in its place was a steady strength. For the first time, I wasn't the woman sacrificing in silence. I was the woman waiting in silence. Because silence, when chosen, is not weakness. It is power. And I held it firmly, ready for the chaos that I knew was about to unfold. The first call came 2 days later. I saw her name flash across the screen, and for a brief moment my heart leapt the way it always had, that instinctive pull of a mother toward her child. But then I remembered the text. I remembered those words. You weren't invited to dinner. My husband doesn't want you there. And I let the phone ring. I didn't silence it. I didn't block it. I just watched the screen until it went dark again, the sound fading into the stillness of the room. More calls followed the next day. At first, her tone in the voicemails was light, almost casual, as though she were trying to erase the ugliness of what had been said. I was wondering if you had time to chat. Call me back, okay? The kind of message she used to leave when she forgot to pick up groceries, or when she needed me to babysit her dog. But I could hear it, the strain just underneath, the slight tremor in her voice. Something wasn't right and she knew it. By the end of that week, the calls multiplied. Sometimes it was her number. Sometimes it was Ethan's. And each time I let it ring. I sat in my kitchen folding laundry, washing dishes, or simply staring out the window at the quiet street. And I let it happen. Every vibration, every jarring sound reminded me of the years I had worked myself to exhaustion, just so she could stand tall. Each ring was another echo of the nights I stayed late at the diner, slipping bills into envelopes marked mortgage payment or utilities. The voicemails began to change. The casual tone slipped into guilt. Mom, it's me. I don't know why you're not answering, but I really need to talk to you. Things are a little tight right now and, well, I thought maybe you could help us figure it out. Please call me back. I sat at the table with the folder of receipts beside me and let her words wash over me. Tight. That was the word she used. As though tight could cover the reality of bills left unpaid. As though tight could mask the truth that without me, their dream home was already beginning to collapse. Then Ethan's voice appeared on the recordings. Cold, clipped, pretending at politeness but laced with irritation. Listen, I don't know what's going on with you, but we need you to call us back. There are things that need to be addressed. It's important. His tone was the same one he used when he looked at me across the dinner table, never quite meeting my eyes. A voice that carried commands disguised as requests. I ignored him too. Another week passed, and the desperation bled through. My daughter's voice cracked in one message. Mom, the mortgage company called today. They said something about missed payments. I don't understand. I thought everything was automatic. Please, can you explain what's going on? I feel like I'm losing control here. Her words pierced me, but I didn't move. I sat in silence, remembering all the time she had brushed me off when Ethan was near. How her visits had grown shorter, her excuses more frequent. And now here she was, realizing that the stability she had taken for granted wasn't some invisible force. It had been me all along. Ethan's voice grew sharper in the next recording. This isn't funny. If you think ignoring us is going to solve anything, you're wrong. We need answers and we need them now. You can't just walk away from responsibilities like this. I almost laughed at that. Responsibilities. The man lecturing me about responsibility had never worked 2 jobs to put food on the table. He had never emptied his savings for someone else's future. He had never carried the burden I had carried in silence. And yet, here he was demanding, as though entitlement gave him the right to dictate terms to me. I let the phone fill up with their voices, pleading, questioning, threatening. I listened to each one once, then set the phone down. I didn't respond. Not with anger. Not with explanation. Silence was my answer. And in that silence, I found strength I didn't know I still had. The power wasn't in shouting back, wasn't in defending myself or begging them to see the truth. It was in holding steady, in letting them feel the weight of the absence they had asked for. They had told me I wasn't wanted. Now they were discovering what that truly meant. Each day their messages grew more frantic. The guilt trips became sharper. Mom, you raised me better than this. How can you just shut me out? I'm your daughter. The threats from Ethan became colder. If this keeps up, you're going to regret it. You can't just play games with people's lives. But I didn't see it as a game. It was clarity. For years I had been the safety net no one acknowledged. Now without me they were dangling in the open. And the longer I stayed silent, the more the truth pressed in on them. Every ring of the phone reminded me of the nights I had scrubbed plates until my hands ached, the mornings I rose before the sun to clock in at a second job, the evenings I spent at home alone so my daughter could go out with friends without worrying about money. Each sound was a reminder of love given freely, and love dismissed without thought. And so I let the calls continue. A week stretched into two stretched into three. My phone was heavy with unheard messages, each one a different shade of panic. And I for the first time felt no panic at all. Because I wasn't the one in need anymore. They were. And they were just beginning to realize it. You hear those calls? That guilt, that sudden change of tone? I lived through it. And I'm sharing it here with you. If you've ever been treated like a doormat, share this video. Someone else out there needs to know they're not alone. It was a Saturday afternoon when I heard the knock at my door. It wasn't the gentle kind, the kind of knock a neighbor gives when they need to borrow sugar or say hello. This one was sharp, insistent. A demand wrapped in the sound of knuckles hitting wood. I knew before I even rose from my chair who it was. I had been expecting it. The calls, the messages, the desperation, they could only hold themselves back for so long before showing up at my doorstep. When I opened the door, my daughter stood there. Her face was flushed, her hair pulled back as though she had come in a rush. Her eyes darted around my porch before they finally met mine, brimming with something between anger and fear. She didn't even wait for me to invite her in. The words spilled out of her like a flood she couldn't control. Mom, what are you doing to us? Why aren't you answering the phone? Do you have any idea what's happening right now? We're drowning, and I don't understand why you would just walk away like this. Her voice cracked, the panic unmistakable. Behind her, Ethan hovered, his arms crossed tightly against his chest, his jaw set like stone. He didn't speak, but his presence was loud enough. His eyes narrowed, burning into me, and I recognized it instantly. The look of a man who felt cornered, not by circumstance, but by control slipping through his fingers. I stood still, letting her words hang in the air. I didn't interrupt. I didn't rush to comfort her the way I used to. I simply listened. When she finally stopped, her breathing ragged, I answered in the same calm tone I had carried since that text arrived. I canceled every single payment, I said evenly, my voice steady as glass. All 195 of them. Every mortgage bill, every utility, every tax. They're yours now. You'll need to take care of your home yourselves. For a moment the world seemed to still. My daughter's mouth fell open, her eyes wide in disbelief. She stepped closer, as though proximity might soften my words, but I didn't move. The silence stretched between us, heavy, undeniable. Then from behind her, Ethan's voice cut through. Low, sharp, dripping with restrained rage. You'll regret this. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The way he said it wasn't a threat shouted in anger. It was a promise whispered with venom. His eyes locked on mine, unblinking, unflinching, and for a brief second I saw the man beneath the charming mask he had worn for so long. Cold. Calculating. The kind of man who believed fear could bend anyone to his will. But I didn't flinch. I didn't answer him. I simply held his gaze, calm, unwavering, as if to tell him silently, I've survived more storms than you could ever imagine. I don't bend anymore. My daughter turned toward him, startled by the sharpness in his tone, then back to me. Mom, please, please, you can't do this to us. We'll lose everything. Don't you care what happens to me? Her words stung, not because they weren't true, but because they showed how blind she had become to the truth that had been in front of her all along. I had cared. For years, I had cared more than anyone else. I had carried them both on my back until my bones ached. And now she stood there, acting as though my refusal to continue was cruelty, when in reality, It was the first time I was giving myself permission to stop. I didn't argue. I didn't explain. I let the weight of my silence fill the space between us. Ethan shifted, his jaw tightening, his hands balling into fists at his sides. His fury was no longer contained. It radiated from him, thick and suffocating. And as they turned to leave, I heard him mutter under his breath, just loud enough for me to catch it. "You'll regret this." The door closed behind them with a soft click, but the echo of his words lingered. It wasn't fear that washed over me. It was clarity. He thought his threats would rattle me, break me, force me to bend once more. But he didn't understand. My regret had burned out years ago, in long nights of sacrifice that were never acknowledged. I had none left to give. I locked the door, walked back to my chair, and sat in silence once more. The storm wasn't over. It was only beginning. The weeks that followed were heavy with silence, at least inside my home. But outside, beyond my walls, whispers began to drift back to me like leaves carried on the wind. At first, it was subtle. A passing comment at the grocery store. A look from a neighbor that lingered a second too long. Then it grew. Friends I had known for years, women from church, acquaintances from town, they started sharing things they thought I should know, things I had never wanted to hear but couldn't ignore. It began with small murmurs about Ethan. "He's been seen down at the bar more than once, playing cards with men who don't exactly have clean reputations." Another voice said, "Didn't he have trouble before he married your daughter? Something about debts, maybe even a foreclosure." I listened quietly, my stomach tightening, piecing together fragments like a puzzle I had never asked to solve. Then came the truth that cut the deepest. Ethan hadn't always been the husband he pretended to be. A neighbor mentioned, almost in a hushed tone, that his first marriage had ended badly. "He walked away owing money," she said softly, glancing over her shoulder as if the words themselves might spark trouble. It wasn't just money either, there were issues. Control, temper. People tried not to talk about it, but it was there. The puzzle sharpened in my mind. Ethan, with his easy smile that never touched his eyes, had never been the man my daughter thought he was. He wasn't building a life with her. He had latched onto her as his way out. His charm was just a mask for a history of failure, debt, and manipulation. And suddenly, all of his small slights toward me, all of his cold stares, all of the times he pulled her away from me, they fell into place. He had married her not for love, but for stability. For the house. For the security I had provided with every one of those 195 receipts. The realization left me hollow at first. I sat alone one night staring at the folder on my desk, and for the first time in a long while I let the tears fall. They weren't just for me. They were for her. For my daughter, who had been so blinded by the idea of a perfect life that she hadn't seen the trap she had walked into. For the child I had raised with so much care, who now stood tethered to a man who saw her not as a partner, but as a possession. I felt like I had failed her. Failed to shield her, failed to guide her, failed to stop her from walking straight into the arms of a man whose past had already written the story of their future. The guilt pressed heavy on my chest, threatening to crush the strength I had built piece by piece. But I am not a woman who stays down for long. That night, through my tears, a new resolve took shape. If she was blind, then I would open her eyes. Not with shouting, not with anger, but with truth undeniable and sharp. She might have chosen to believe in him over me, but the world had already begun showing cracks in his mask. And when the time came, when the weight of his lies bore down too heavily, I would be there, not to save them, but to show her that I had known all along. I thought back to the text, the dismissal, the cruel way she had shut me out. It still hurt, yes, but it no longer defined me. What defined me now was clarity. He had married her for what I had built. He had stood behind her on my porch, silent and seething, because he knew the lifeline had been severed. Without me, he had nothing to stand on. And soon enough, she would see it too. The community whispers weren't just rumors anymore. They were warnings I had ignored too long. But now I was listening. Now I was watching. And now I was ready. Because if Ethan thought he could strip me of dignity, or use my daughter as his shield, he was wrong. My silence wasn't surrender. It was preparation. And when the truth came crashing down around them, I would not look away. It was late in the evening when I imagined her kitchen table littered with envelopes, the kind no one wants to open. Bank notices, overdue slips, warnings typed in red ink. I could see her sitting there with shaking hands, sliding her finger under the flap, praying it was some mistake, praying the numbers staring back weren't real. But reality doesn't bend for wishes. It only sharpens when you've been blind to it too long. The first message from her came in a rush, the words tumbling out like stones hurled against glass. "Why would you do this to me, Mom? You're ruining my life." I read it slowly, again and again. The letters glowing on the screen. There was no acknowledgement of what I had already given her, no pause to remember the years I had carried her through storms she never even felt on her skin. To her, my silence and my withdrawal were cruelty. She couldn't yet see that what I had done was an act of release, not destruction. I let the phone sit in my hand for a while, my thumb hovering above the keyboard. For a long time I said nothing. But then, with a calmness that surprised even me, I typed my reply. No, I'm giving you your life back. Without him controlling me, or you through money. I pressed send and set the phone down. No more explanation. No pages of justification. No pleading for her to understand. Just truth laid bare in a single sentence. I pictured her reading it, the way her breath might catch, the way she might look up at Ethan with questions in her eyes. She wanted to believe I was the villain, but deep down she knew. She had felt the tightening grip of his control, the way his presence dictated her words and her silences alike. She had defended him, yes, but even the strongest defense cracks when reality demands to be seen. The phone buzzed again minutes later. A string of messages this time, anger laced with desperation. You've abandoned me. You don't care about me anymore. You want me to fail. How could you turn your back on your only daughter? I read each one in silence, my hands steady, my heart heavy but firm. She didn't understand, not yet. To her, love had always been measured in dollars, instability bought with sacrifice. She had never learned that love could also mean stepping back, letting the tower fall so she could see who had built it in the first place. I didn't answer again. Not because I had nothing to say, but because I had already said enough. The truth was planted whether she wanted it or not. And sometimes the hardest truths have to sit in the dark before they bloom into recognition. That night, as I closed my eyes, I thought of the little girl who once held my hand on the first day of school, who once leaned on me when the world felt too big. That little girl still lived inside her somewhere, even if Ethan's shadow had tried to smother it, and if she had to walk through fire to find her way back, then so be it. I could no longer carry her burden, not when she had chosen to place it in the wrong hands. The notices would keep coming, the pressure would keep building, and the cracks between them would only deepen. My role now was not to shield her from the breaking point, it was to let it come. Because sometimes, only in the breaking does the truth finally set you free. Sometimes strength is saying no, even when your heart aches. If you believe women should never be silenced or used for their sacrifices, hit that subscribe button. Stand with me. The silence was my greatest weapon, and I wore it like armor. I didn't chase after them with explanations. I didn't storm their doorstep demanding acknowledgement. I simply stepped back and allowed reality to seep into the spaces I had once filled with sacrifice. And reality, I knew, was relentless. Ethan had walked into that house with pride swollen in his chest, as though the bricks and beams were built from his ambition alone. But without my steady hand behind the curtain, the illusion unraveled quickly. The payments loomed larger than his paycheck. The deadlines came sharper than his words. The foundation of their so-called dream home turned into a weight around his neck. I heard whispers before they reached me directly, neighbors murmuring about late-night arguments, his car parked at bars instead of in the driveway, her standing at the window with swollen eyes. Each whisper was confirmation that silence was working better than confrontation ever could. I had given them the stage, and Ethan was exposing himself line by line. My daughter, once so quick to defend him, began to slow her words whenever his name came up. I noticed it in the brief phone call she managed, her voice cracking in places she tried to mask with laughter. She avoided details, dodged questions, but silence has its own language. I could hear her breaking even in the pauses between her breaths. Ethan grew sharper with her. The charm that once coated his tongue like honey dried into something bitter. His tone cut instead of soothed. Where once he had played the doting husband in public, now even in gatherings he let the mask slip, rolling his eyes, silencing her with a glare. And still I said nothing. I let him reveal himself piece by piece, like a portrait painted in truth instead of lies. The day she came to me, her steps were heavy, her face pale. She didn't speak right away. She just stood in my doorway, holding herself as though the weight of the world sat on her shoulders. I didn't ask questions. I simply stepped aside and let her in, the way a mother always does, no matter how deep the betrayal. She sat at my kitchen table, the very place where I had once counted receipts, where I had once smiled at the thought of giving her a future. Now it was the place she chose to unburden her soul. Her eyes glistened with tears she could no longer hold back. "Mom," she whispered, her voice shaking. "I didn't see it. I swear I didn't see it." I didn't rush to fill the silence. I let her words tumble out in their own time. And they did. Piece by piece, confession by confession, she admitted what I had long known. Ethan had pushed for the house more than she had. He had charmed her with promises, then turned those promises into chains. He had convinced her to distance herself from me, to choose him over the one person who had always stood by her. And now, with the bills piling, his words had turned cold, his patience had curdled into cruelty. He blames me, she sobbed, her hands trembling against the table. He says it's my fault you stopped paying. He says I should have controlled you, made you understand. But Mom, I don't even know who he is anymore. I reached across the table, my hand covering hers, not with the desperation of a mother begging for her child's return, but with the steady strength of a woman who had seen storms before. You're seeing him now, I said softly. The man he always was. You just weren't ready to see it before. Her tears fell faster, her shoulders shaking with the force of everything she had been holding in. In that moment, she was no longer the daughter who had pushed me away, no longer the woman blinded by love's disguise. She was the little girl I once rocked to sleep after nightmares, seeking comfort in the one place she had tried to abandon. And though my heart ached for her, though every fiber of me wanted to protect her from the hurt, I knew this breaking was necessary. For years, I had shielded her, sacrificed for her, given until there was almost nothing left of me. This time I had given her the gift of truth, and truth, though brutal, is the only thing that sets us free. I didn't gloat. I didn't remind her of the text that had broken me. I didn't say, I told you so. My silence had already spoken louder than words ever could. My revenge wasn't loud or violent. It was measured, patient, and devastatingly effective. Ethan had wanted me erased. He had wanted my money, my silence, my absence. And in the end, it was the very silence he underestimated that unraveled everything he tried to build. My daughter sat before me, tears streaming, finally seeing what I had seen all along. That was my victory. Not in crushing them, not in shouting my worth, but in watching the truth come to light on its own. Silent revenge had unfolded exactly as it needed to, and now the pieces lay scattered on the table between us, hers to pick up and his to choke on. Ethan didn't leave with a grand announcement. No suitcases dragged across the driveway, no apologies left in the air. He slipped out the way cowards always do, quietly, in the middle of responsibility. One morning his car was gone, his closet half empty, his promises erased like chalk on wet pavement. And in that void, the weight of every overdue bill, every unanswered call, every angry word fell squarely on my daughter's shoulders. She came back to me, not with triumph, not even with relief, but with a kind of brokenness I had never seen in her before. She was thinner, her eyes rimmed with exhaustion, her voice carrying the fragility of someone who had been stretched too far. She sat across from me, not demanding comfort, not demanding forgiveness, just sitting, her silence loud enough to say what words could not. I didn't rush to close the gap between us. For years I had stepped in too quickly, smoothing edges, fixing mistakes, shielding her from the rawness of reality. This time, I allowed the silence to linger. Growth, I had learned, requires space. Healing doesn't happen in the arms of someone who erases every consequence. It happens when you face those consequences and still choose to stand. She sat in my kitchen, the same chair she had occupied as a child while I packed her school lunches, the same chair where she once told me about her first crush, her first heartbreak, her dreams of a family. Now she sat older, weathered, carrying the bruises of decisions made too fast, trust given to the wrong man. When she finally spoke, her voice trembled. I don't expect you to forgive me right away. I don't even know how to forgive myself. I watched her, and though my heart ached to rush to her side, to wrap her in the safety she once rejected, I held myself steady. Forgiveness was not a gift to hand out easily. It was a process, one that required honesty, accountability, time. You don't need my forgiveness right now, I said slowly. You need to forgive yourself. You let someone speak for you. You let someone pull you away from the people who loved you most. And now you see the cost. The question is, what will you do with that knowledge? Her tears came freely then, not the panicked sobs of desperation but the quieter kind, the kind that comes when truth finally settles in. She nodded, her shoulders shaking, her hands clutching the mug of coffee I had set in front of her, though it had long since gone cold. The days that followed were not easy. She stayed in her house, not mine, learning to navigate bills, responsibilities, and solitude without Ethan's shadow looming over her. She came to me in fragments, sometimes for advice, sometimes for nothing more than company. I didn't flood her with lectures, didn't hold her mistakes over her head. I gave her what I had learned to give myself, silence, space, and patience. And slowly, carefully, something began to shift. The wall between us, once built from hurt and betrayal, began to show cracks of light. She laughed again, though it was softer, gentler, carrying a humility that hadn't been there before. She asked about my day, truly asked, not out of obligation but from a place of wanting to know. She stood beside me in the kitchen, chopping vegetables as though nothing had ever torn us apart, and yet everything had. I didn't welcome her back with open arms in one grand gesture. That would have been too easy, too false. Instead, I welcomed her back in the small ways, the patience to listen without judgment, the quiet presence when she didn't have words, the strength to let her rebuild herself without me carrying all of her weight. Forgiveness didn't come overnight, but little by little we began to stitch together something new. Not the bond we once had, it could never be exactly that again, but a bond forged from lessons learned, scars acknowledged, and love that had endured even through betrayal. And in the quiet of those days, I realized that my silent revenge had not only freed me, it had freed her too. She had seen Ethan for what he truly was, and though it broke her, it also built her. She walked differently now, spoke with more certainty, looked at me with an understanding she hadn't carried before. Our story wasn't tied up neatly. There were still wounds, still nights she cried herself to sleep, still moments I questioned if she would ever fully understand the depth of what had been lost. But for the first time in years, I felt something I thought had been stolen from me the day that text arrived. When I sit alone now, when the house is quiet and the sun slips low behind the trees, I find myself replaying the chapters of what happened. Not because I want to live in the pain again, but because reflection has a way of pulling truth from even the darkest corners. Betrayal, people often think it's tied to money, to houses, to material loss. But that's not where its sting truly lies. Betrayal is rooted in respect, or the lack of it. That text my daughter sent me, the one line that cut deeper than any blade, wasn't about a dinner. It was about her choice to let someone else dictate my worth in her life. It was about allowing a man to decide whether her own mother had a seat at the table. That was the wound, sharper than any financial cost. And yet, when I look back, I realize something important. I had a choice in that moment. I could have begged. I could have fought for scraps of dignity at a table, where I was no longer welcome. Or I could step back and reclaim something far more powerful, my silence. Silence is often misunderstood. People think it's weakness, surrender, a sign that you have no fight left. But I learned it is the opposite. Silence can be thunderous. Silence can move mountains. Silence gives people space to hear the echo of their own mistakes. And that echo can shake a life more than any shouted confrontation ever could. Helping my daughter buy that house was never about bricks and walls. It was about love, about wanting her to have the stability I once fought so hard to provide. When that love was met with dismissal, I didn't stop being a mother. I simply shifted into a different kind of protector. Sometimes love doesn't mean cushioning every fall. Sometimes love means stepping back, letting them stumble, even letting them break, because only then will they learn how to stand again on their own feet. I have been called strong before, but strength isn't loud. It doesn't always roar. Strength can be quiet, steady, deliberate. Strength is found in the woman who sits at her kitchen table, lays out 195 receipts, and says nothing as the phone rings and rings. Strength is choosing dignity over desperation. And the lesson I carry, the one I want anyone listening to hold on to: strong women don't need to shout to be heard. They move in silence. They act with precision. And when they do, their silence is what shakes everything around them. I may have lost pieces of trust along the way. I may have endured heartbreak at the hands of the one person I thought would never turn against me. But in the end, I gained something more lasting. I gained the knowledge that my worth isn't defined by anyone's invitation. My place at the table isn't granted by a text. It was built long before that, carved out of years of sacrifice, of resilience, of love that doesn't waver even when tested. And though my daughter had to learn her lessons the hardest way, I see now that the silence I gave her was not a punishment. It was a gift. A hard gift, yes, but one that allowed her to see truth without my voice crowding her judgment. And in that truth, she has begun to rebuild herself, not as a woman leaning on false promises, but as a woman who finally understands her own strength. That is the moral of this story. That is the quiet legacy I leave behind. And it is enough. My story does not close with fireworks or applause. It closes the way truth always does. Quietly, with the weight of lessons learned and the sound of doors finally closing behind what was never meant to last. I think often about the woman I was before that message lit up my phone screen. The mother who believed love alone could soften sharp edges, who thought sacrifice would always be honored with gratitude. That woman no longer exists. In her place stands someone steadier, sharper, someone who has learned the cost of silence and the power it carries. I don't relive those words to punish myself, but sometimes I still hear them. You weren't invited to dinner. My husband doesn't want you there. They come back to me in moments of stillness, not as a wound anymore, but as a marker. a line drawn in time where everything shifted. For a while I thought that text was the end of something precious. I thought it severed the bond one spent years building. But now I see it was only the beginning of something else, an awakening, for her and for me, because my daughter did lose something. She lost him, the man she thought was her protector, the man she allowed to decide my worth. And though the loss tore her apart, it also forced her to see who she was when the illusion crumbled. She began to rebuild from there, piece by piece, her spine straightening in ways I had never seen before. I got to witness it. Quietly. Patiently. Without needing to shout. I told you so. Every canceled payment, every ignored call, every sleepless night sitting alone at my table with those 195 receipts. It was all leading to that truth. She thought she was choosing him over me. But in the end, he was the one who disappeared. And she was the one who returned. Not the same, not unscarred, but stronger. And as I stand here now telling this story, I realize something important. The receipts weren't just records of money spent. They were proof of love, of sacrifice, of every brick laid with my sweat and tears. And when I canceled them, I wasn't erasing my love. I was reclaiming my dignity. So, if there is one thing I want you to remember, one truth I want to leave ringing in your ears, it is this. My daughter thought she was choosing him over me. But in the end, she lost him and found herself. And that, to me, was worth every canceled receipt. If this story touched you, don't just scroll away. Like, comment, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Because silence may shake a family, but your voice can change the world.